cloud. Okay, we are recording. 2 more folks coming in. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming back, and I'll just do a brief recap from last time. Sorry? Okay, I'm gonna put, I'll put folks on mute, and while I'm speaking, feel free to throw a question in the chat, and then I'll notice that, and then we'll have time, of course, to open it up at the end. What we talked about last month was Emperor Frederick III, who was the Emperor of Germany for 99 days, or 100. It's where the idea, one of the ways that this, several ways where we get this idea, 100 days thing. Because presidents, what do they accomplish in their first 100 days? He was only emperor for 100 days because he was suffering from cancer of the throat, and he was not even able to speak during his reign, and then he did die within that. So it's called 1888. It's called the three emperor year, the three Kaiser year, because the founding emperor of the United Germany, William I, dies, and then his son Frederick is a very short reign, and then is succeeded by his son, who is William II. The reason why we focused on Frederick last month is because there was the hope that he would be a liberal-minded emperor. He was, he did associate with the liberal parties, and the Jewish community, especially in Germany, had high hopes in his reign, and it was a real blow for Jewish hopes when he died. His son, William II, as we had discussed last month, was more of a right-winger. There's debate whether not to call him anti-Semitic himself, but he did associate more with the anti-Semites who in the 1890s and 1900s were anti-Semitism was being associated with the right-wing nationalist parties. So, and the other thing about Frederick III, which is important as we talk about World War I, is that Frederick III was Queen Victoria's grandson. And one of the reasons why he was a more liberal emperor and a liberal crown prince is that he was influenced by the success of liberal parliamentary politics in Britain. So there was the hope that he was, and I'm sure he would have instilled that culture or helped to cultivate that culture in Germany. When the Emperor Frederick dies and William II ascends the throne, he takes Germany in a direction of increased hyper-nationalism, which sends it on a course towards World War I. So had Frederick not suffered from cancer and died in 1888, I don't think Germany, it's very possible that World War I would never have happened, because he would have been aligned more with Britain and with the liberal democracies, and might not have been as obsessed in the arms race that Imperial Germany and the British Empire had engaged in the years that led up to the explosion of the alliance system in 1914, which is when World War I breaks. Instead, we had the young William II on the throne of the German Empire, and William II was determined that Germany should be the great power and be a rival to Britain, and a lot was put into the building of a German navy to rival the British Navy as the preeminent naval force, and the buildup of the army as well. There was the rush to acquire colonies in Africa that Germany engaged in under William II. And then there's the showdown that leads to the opening of World War I. So that's why Frederick III is important, because everything would have gone on a different trajectory if he had served a if he had reigned for several decades rather than his young son taking over. Let me say a word about sort of how we get into World War I, if Germany could have won instead of lost, and what that means not only for the trajectory of world history, but specifically for Jewish history, which is the subject of today's talk. I've used this idea of thinking here about alternate Jewish history as we go through the whole course of Jewish history. We started in the fall talking about the temple. What if the temple had not been destroyed in the first century? So we spent looked a bit on ancient history, the temple, and then on the Emperor Julian. Then we were focused. We spent a session on the Muslim conquest in the medieval period and the development of the Talmud and what that meant there. And then we moved into modern history. We're talking about Emperor Frederick last month. We're going to spend time on the next month is what if the Holocaust didn't happen? And then what if Rabin were not assassinated? We'll talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict there. Of all the talks in this spread between ancient, medieval, and modern history, it's tonight's talk that is the most exciting for me because my field is World War I. I wrote my dissertation on Jews serving in the German army in the First World War. And one of the questions that I was focused on in my book, that's the same as my dissertation, was specifically the question of anti-Semitism and this question of what direction might Germany have gone, which was what we started to talk about last month with Emperor Friedrich. Because during the Weimar period, which is the first republic in Germany that follows World War I, and the growing nationalism and the growth of the right-wing parties and the anti-Semites to the point that the Nazis come to power in 1933, a lot of the discourse is blaming the Jews for Germany's defeat and claiming the Jews didn't do their part, they weren't patriotic. And I knew from my research that the Jews did serve their country in the First World War, and it's about they don't know the number. We assume it's about 100,000 Jews would have put on the uniform to defend their fatherland. We know that 12,000 German Jewish soldiers were killed in the First World War in service to their country. One of the things that inspired me most when I was doing my research was that there's in the large Jewish cemetery in Berlin, which is called the Weissensee Cemetery, there is a section that's the military section, and there are about 360 Jewish graves there, World War I fatalities. It happens to be the largest Jewish military cemetery outside of Israel, is in Berlin, of Jewish soldiers who fought the German army in World War I. And their story inspired me. And one of the questions that I was asking myself as I did the research for my dissertation was, if I could tell their story in a way that their effort would not have necessarily been in vain, right? Because we're looking at it from the hindsight of history. First of all, they fought for a lost cause because the Germans lost the war. But also they're fighting for a fatherland that turns against them afterwards. But could it have gone a different direction? Right? And one of the questions is, if Germany had won the war, things might have been different, and we'll get into that soon. So I looked at the questions that the German army was so anti-Semitic against the Jews, and it didn't, they were discriminated against. I looked for another story, and I looked for stories of Jews who were integrated in the army, who the experience at the front is a leveling field between castes, between religions. And I also looked for quantitative evidence about how the Jews were integrated. And I believe I made a case that the Jews in the army were actually being promoted at a faster rate than the general the general population in the army, that the Jews were so patriotic and so devoted to their country and the contribution that they made, that they were being promoted at a rate that was slightly faster than the general rate. And I looked at different ways to come up with the numbers that worked that way. I didn't know that the numbers would work out. I hope that they did. And when I ran them, they did work. I was looking at the average age of Jewish second lieutenants who were killed and compared that to the average age of all second lieutenants that were killed. And I found that the Jewish fallen second lieutenants were on average about 6.5 months younger than the general population. So if they were younger, that means they were getting promoted faster. It was just a window that I got to try to answer the question that was being asked. There was a census of the Jews in World War I that a lot of historians say this was proof that the Germans were anti-Semitic. The results of the census were lost, apparently burned in the bombing of the German military archives in the Second World War. But after the war, without the government never released the results. The Jews claimed it proved that the Jews were well represented in the service and were in the army. The anti-Semites argued it proved that they were underrepresented. And you have publications in the 20s and 30s, each contesting the other, but we don't have the results, so there's no way to know. So the only way was looking at certain numbers based on fatalities that I was doing, or look at the evidence that Jewish soldiers wrote from their letters, from their memoirs, from their diaries of their experience in the war. And as I did the research, the story that it told me was that there was another direction that Germany could have gone, because they did succeed, and they did not face an anti-Semitic. Did they face some anti-Semitism? Sure. Of course, there was anti-Semitism in the German army, but there was always also anti-Semitism in the American army, and also in the French army, right? The famous Dreyfus trial. So the question is, was the anti-Semitism different in Germany that set Germany on a path where the Holocaust was inevitable? And this is where it's the major debate among historians of modern Germany, is that was Germany on a special path towards the Shoah, towards the Holocaust, or could things have gone differently at different times? And if they could have gone differently, what were those times when things could have gone differently? For me, there was a moral element of the question also, because if we say the Germans were going to do the Holocaust, right? They were destined to evil, then that's a passing of the buck. That's saying that this was just a German problem. Whereas if we say that it wasn't necessary, it didn't necessarily have to happen in Germany, then we're saying that it could happen anywhere. So that's scarier, but it's making it universal, saying that human beings are capable of doing terrible things, not because they're German as opposed to French or English or American, but rather because of the conditions that they face given the particular circumstances. That's what we talked about when we started this discussion in the late spring. We were talking about Philip Roth's book, that when is it possible America might have gone a different direction, right? In the Plot Against America is the book I'm talking about, where we could have approached a Holocaust in this country. And we looked at The Man in the High Castle also to see how America could become Nazi-like had things gone a different direction. So keeping those questions in mind, let's talk about World War I, and then I'll explain why it's a turning point and how things might have developed differently. The world enters World War I in 1914. Some of you are familiar with the story. I'll say it very briefly. The Archduke Ferdinand, who's the crown Prince of Austria, the Habsburgs, is assassinated in Sarajevo. And then the Austrians are oppressing the Serbians because they're furious what happened. They have an investigation. They have a whole series of demands to find the assassins. And the Serbians are driven by their nationalism and stand up to Austria, and they're being backed by Russia. So Austria makes certain demands that Serbia doesn't meet. So Austria declares war on Serbia. It might have been just a small issue between Austria and Serbia, but Russia backs up the Serbs. So then when Russia is at war with Austria, Germany declares war on Russia because of Germany's alliance with Austria. When Germany is at war now with Russia, that causes France to declare war on Germany because France is in an alliance with Russia. So you have Germany is now stuck at a two-front war with France on the western front and Russia on the eastern front. Germany has the most powerful army in Europe, but the problem is the British. So how do the British get involved? The British are not bound to join the war because France is at war with Germany, though Britain did have an alliance with France. The reason why the UK joins the war is because Germany invades Belgium. And I'm going through this like a blitzkrieg here. It's right, fast war history. Why does Germany invade Belgium? Belgium was a neutral country, but Germany had developed this. You have two different sides. You have the diplomats that worked out the alliance system that's for most of the 19th century had maintained the peace, because I can't attack this country because then that country is going to be at war with me, and then this country and that country. So unless the whole house of cards falls down, that's why we have to not attack each other. That fell apart in 1914. It worked until then. But in addition to the diplomatic strategy, there's also the military strategy. So the German high command was always aware that they had a problem of a two-front war with France in the west and Russia in the east. So their solution to that problem was that Russia was not industrialized. Russia was more backwards. So it would take Russia a while to mobilize its forces until it could be a real threat to Germany. So Germany knew that it had some time before it had to worry about Russia. So the key to win a two-front war was to knock France out. So the way you knock France out is you take the capital, you take Paris. You think about an old game like Capture the Flag, right? So how do you, but France, remember, France and Germany had a war in 1870, 1871. It's called the Austro-Prussian War. It's the war that resulted in the unification of Germany and the German Empire. And Alsace and Lorraine, which are those border provinces between France and Germany, had become German after then. And since 1871, the French were obsessed with reclaiming Alsace and Lorraine, where the city of Strasbourg is. It's where Metz is. It's the area of France that's the most Jewish, because they was the Ashkenazic Yiddish-speaking Jews that lived there. When the French Revolution happened, in 1789, the French National Assembly meets. The big debate about emancipation of the Jews was, what do we do with all those Yiddish-speaking Jews in Alsace and Lorraine? Because they're not really French. The Jews in Paris spoke French. They were Sephardic Jews. But the Jews in Alsace and Lorraine spoke Yiddish. So it was a very Jewish area, and it was right on the border, and Germany had seized it in 1871. So the French were obsessed with reclaiming it. And they had fortified the entire border between France and Germany with the idea of one day reclaiming the territory they lost in 1871. So the German high command, the strategy is, we're not going to go through the French defenses. We're going to go around the classic circling maneuver. We're going to go through Belgium. Belgium's neutral, so no one's watching the border. And then we sneak into France the back way and run to Paris behind the French forces. And before they can turn around, we will have seized the capital, and then the French will sue for peace, and then the whole war will be over, and then we can take care of Russia. That was Germany's battle plan. And the military historian, John Keegan, was one of the most respected military historians. In his book in World War I, he says the only reason it didn't happen was because they didn't have good radio contact. Today, we would say they didn't have GPSs. So you had several different German divisions that were going through Belgium, and they conquered Belgium easily. and then it's like circle from Germany, from Belgium into France, and they weren't aligned properly with each other. And even though they determined each train and each amount of miles you had to travel each day, the different divisions, because they weren't able to just pick up a phone and coordinate with each other, didn't have the ease of radio contact in World War I the way they had in World War II. So for that reason, it was a little disorganized, and the invasion stalled about 80 miles north of Paris. And that was enough time for the French to come, and with the help of the British. The reason why the British joined the war was because of the German violation of Belgian neutrality, because the UK was a guarantor of Belgium's neutrality. The Germans thought, okay, but we're going to win before the British can do anything about it. But that was the reason why the British joined the war. They have the British Expeditionary Force. They crossed the Channel to France, and with the French-British force is able to stall the German invasion, and then they dig the trenches. And then the trench warfare starts that stalled on that line, basically Belgium into northern France for 4 years, with just back and forth by a quarter mile this way and that way. And the Germans can't put any more force, because then they have to send some of their forces back to the Eastern Front, because now the Russians are posing a danger. And Berlin is in the east of Germany, and they have all of the Prussian lands east of that. So they have to send their forces to Russia. They end up defeating Russia. And Russia, the Russian Empire collapses. There's a Russian Revolution. The Germans send their secret weapon, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, on a sealed train so that he will stir up revolution against the Republican government, the Kerensky government in Russia that had unseated the Tsar. And Lenin does exactly what the Germans had hoped for. He brings down the Republican government, establishes the communist government, and the first thing the Soviet Union does is sue for peace with Germany, because Lenin said, we're not interested in these bourgeois wars. So now Russia's out of the war. There's one front, and Germany then now has an opportunity of winning the war. So they already had several opportunities to win. They could have won at the very beginning if they had been a bit more lucky in the way that their troops moved. They were only 80 miles shy of getting to Paris. Now, the second chance of winning the war was after 1917, after Russia's out. And they build up their forces, and they have to concentrate on a push through to break through the British-French line in the West. So there was a big debate in the German government over how to do this. Part of the problem was that the advantage that the British and the French had over the Germans was that the British had blockaded Germany. And there was a blockade of the continent, the same way the British had blockaded Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. And the British Navy had defeated the German Navy in supremacy of the seas. But the German Navy had one more weapon left, the U-boats. So the plan was, if they could sink ships that were supplying the British and the French forces from Britain and from the British Empire. The problem is, the UK was also being supplied by trading ships from the United States. So the only way to really starve Britain was to sink all the ships that would not, would still try to trade and not respect the Germans' order of a blockade of the UK. So they sank the Lusitania, and ships, and that was what eventually drew the US into the war. Now, at the big debate, the side in Germany said no to Emperor William. They said, we can't do this because the US is going to join the war. But the Kaiser said, and the command, the military command said, it doesn't matter. The US is just like Russia, huge resources, but very slow moving. And there's no way that the US is going to mobilize in time to save France, and that we will still be able to break through by the time the US mobilizes. they were right about Russia, but they were wrong about America, right? And that fear of American mobilization is the same reason why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, right, in World War II, because they did to prevent the U.S. from mobilizing, and the U.S. was able to mobilize despite the hit in Pearl Harbor and still defeat the Japanese even before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what happens on this end? What happens on this end is that Woodrow Wilson, who was elected on a platform of he kept us out of war, organizes the first war economy in the US, where everything is centralized under Washington's control in order to maximize US production and to send hundreds of thousands of troops across the ocean. And that's where the song over there, right? When American soldiers are being sent across the Atlantic and they show up in time to buttress the British and French forces and stall the German attack in 1918. When that happens, the Germans see there's no way we can win. Because now the Americans are sending more and more troops over. And that's when they sue for peace. So they see we can't win. And they sue for peace. And then they have the armistice, which is November 11th, 1918 is the armistice that ends the war. So had Wilson not made that leap into war, had he held firm with the neutrality, Germany could have won. Had the Wilson administration not been as effective in putting in place a war economy and sending American troops over, Germany would have won. Now, but Germany lost. So those were the moments where the war could have gone a different direction. The effect of Germany losing World War I, and we have to understand the effect before we think about how it would be different if they won, is what happens after Versailles. Right? If you remember your basic history, you have to give one explanation of why Hitler comes to power, it's because of the resentment of the Versailles Treaty, right? Because the Germans were so humiliated by the treaty that part of it was the reparations that they had to pay. Part of it was that the Allied forces maintained occupation of the Rhineland. But the most humiliating part of this treaty was at the very end of the Versailles Treaty of something called the War Guilt Clause. And what it said is that the German government accepts responsibility, that it was their aggression that was responsible for the war. Now, historians of World War I say that it was an unfair, besides the implications of it, it's an unfair judgment. Was Germany aggressive under Kaiser Wilhelm? Of course it was. But the British and the French and the Russians were also aggressive. Right? There was aggression and there was brinkmanship on both sides. And everyone was responsible, no side more than the other, for the war happening. But Germany was forced to accept guilt. Usually what a peace treaty does is it brings sides back together so they can move forward in peace. What Versailles did, unfortunately for the Germans, is it says you are at fault. You caused this problem. There were calls. The Clemenceau, the French wanted to try the Kaiser for war crimes. He ended up moving to had asylum in Denmark and didn't have to face trial. And the way that Versailles happened also, usually a peace treaty is negotiated. That didn't happen at the end of World War I. What happened was that when the Germans said we want an armistice, Woodrow Wilson said, I'm not going to make peace with an emperor. I'm only going to make peace with a democracy. So if you want an end to the fighting, you have to become a democracy, because the point of this war was to make the world safe for democracy. So immediately, the German government went to the Kaiser and said, sorry, Bill, but it's game over. When you have a lot of leaders all tell the person in charge it's time to resign, sometimes he doesn't, but in this case, William did resign, right? All the senators, all the legislators, the prime minister, they all said you have to resign. And the Kaiser resigned, and all of the other kings, the king of Saxony resigned, the king of Bavaria, and all of the hereditary leaders all set aside their thrones, and a republic was established, which is we call the Weimar Republic, because that was the town where it was established. And then Germany has elected as a republic that has representative leadership, and that was the condition that Woodrow Wilson set to establish the war. Now, it was well intended. We think about, George Bush in the Iraq War. We had this great idea that Iraq would become a friendly democracy. Well, that was what Woodrow Wilson was thought for too. And in a sense, there was a greater chance of it happening in Germany than Iraq, because Germany was a first world country. And that's forcing the Kaiser to leave and become a democracy wasn't the mistake. The mistake was forcing the treaty and the shame that the treaty brought on the Germans. Because the other thing that happened is once the armistice happened, then the German army goes home and they demobilize. They send everybody home. But they hadn't negotiated the treaty yet. And they go back, and all the armies go back to their borders. And then the Allies said, we're going to have a preliminary discussion first, an Allies conference before we sit down with the other side. And that's the negotiation between Woodrow Wilson and Clemenceau, the French premier, David Lloyd George, the British prime minister, Orlando, the Italian prime minister, and then all the other allied groups. And they spend 6 months in Paris debating and deciding and having hearings. And then they write a whole treaty. And the actual treaty negotiation was when the delegation of the Germans were summoned to Versailles. So it's called Versailles, where they had the ceremony. And they said, here is the treaty, sign it. You got 24 hours. And the Germans had no negotiating position then, because they had already withdrawn their army. The advantage that Germany had the entire war was that the war was fought on Allied territory. The German army was in Belgium and France. The Allies never stepped foot on German territory. They withdrew their army when the armistice came, and then now it was then they negotiated. So they not only lost the war, they also lost the peace. Had they kept their army in place, they would have had a card on the table. By pulling their army back, and they were exhausted, understand why they did, they had no cards on the table, so there was no negotiation, and they were forced to sign it. And the result of that was that the nationalists, the anti-Semites in Germany, were able to blame the liberal Republican government for accepting a shameful peace. So said, our army never lost, because our army was in France. They were undefeated. It was the Jewish socialists, the Democrats. They were the ones who ruined everything, because then they accepted this treaty that was so shameful that says it's our fault that this war happened. The Germans all believed they were fighting a defensive war, same as everybody else. So the way that the peace went down was a disaster in terms of bringing Germany to a better place. It was a punitive treaty. Woodrow Wilson understood that. And his approach was, if we have a League of Nations, then the treaty is not sealed. We establish an international ongoing debating club, which the League was supposed to be, then we could continue to revise it. The problem was the Senate didn't approve the treaty, so the US didn't enter the League of Nations. And so that was, so that's where we get to after the war. And in a new book I'm reading by Helmut Walzer Smith, is a wonderful historian of German history, who's teaches at Vanderbilt in Nashville. He made a point, he's talking about the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but the same thing applies here. He says when nationalism really grows, it's more often than not as a result of a great victory, but rather the result of a great defeat. The idea of German nationalism first begins in the early 19th century, not because the Germans defeated Napoleon, but because the French forces invaded Prussia, and because their fatherland was invaded. And that shame was what riled them up to come to the defense of a nation. Same thing happens after World War I. The nationalism that the Nazis rode into power on was a nationalism of defeat, of a humiliated country. It said that this was a wrong and we have to right the wrong, not just of Versailles, of the treaty, but of World War I. We have to correct, we have to do it right this time. So the defeat, having lost the Great War, was the number one thing that drove the Nazis into power. Had Germany won the war, not only would it have gone a different path and would not have turned towards the Nazis and anti-Semites might have developed, but more importantly, the German nationalism would not have gone to the extreme that it did. So if any of those things had happened differently, if the war had not started, if it never happened in the first place, if Frederick didn't have cancer, or if in 1914, if the Russians didn't back up the Serbs, or if the French didn't back up the Russians, or if the British didn't back up the Belgians and the French, or if the Germans didn't back up the Austrians, right? Then the war wouldn't have happened. And if the war did happen and the Germans had been more successful in going after Paris, or if they had not done the submarine warfare against the US and the US wouldn't have joined the war then in 1917, maybe they didn't need to attack to sink the ships. They could have won anyway. Or if they had not withdrawn their army and had a firmer negotiating hand, because the war really was a draw, right, between the two sides. The Germans withdrew because they just knew it wasn't sustainable, because the German high command made the responsible decision that Hitler was incapable of making in 1945. They understood if we can't win the war, there's no point in continuing the fight if we can't win. And if the treaty then, right, if Wilson had not put all his eggs in the basket of the League of Nations and had instead insisted on eliminating the war guilt clause, then that would have taken the wind out of the sails of the Nazis that drove them into power. So all of those things would have taken, that's a long question there, so can't read that too quickly. I'll go to it soon. So all of those things would have made it far less likely that the Nazis would have come to power, and far less likely that the Shoah, that the Holocaust then would have subsequently happened in Germany. The question then that it brings to my mind is, if Germany wins the war, and then as a result, the Nazis don't come to power and the Holocaust doesn't happen in Germany, would the Holocaust have happened somewhere else? If ugly nationalism takes root in a culture of shame, right, and a culture of humiliation, then would the Holocaust have happened on the other side? I mean, in Russia, in France, in Britain. So I don't think so. And this is the reason why. First of all, Russia also lost World War I, even though Russia was on the Allied side. So they already lost, and the Holocaust didn't happen in Russia. I don't think a Holocaust could have happened in the UK. There weren't enough Jews in England. You know, it was, the anti-Semitism was a much more potent force in the electoral politics in Germany because of the position of the Jews in society. And because the Jews were associated with the liberals, because they voted liberal. They were associated with the turn of events that the right wing built their built their votes, that Hitler built the votes on the resentment of the successes of the middle class and of the liberals. So what about France? So I was thinking a lot about France, right? And yeah, you do have the Dreyfus trial in France. And that's the same time that Herzl establishes the Zionist movement, because he sees that in the modern country of France, the country of the French Revolution, if it could turn against Alfred Dreyfus, who was a patriotic French officer, and it could find him guilty of espionage just because he was Jewish with no real evidence, driven by this hatred of the Jews and anti-Semitism, that's what drove Herzl, among other things, what drove Herzl to the conclusion, this is why we need a Jewish state. If Jews can't be safe in France, it can't be safe anywhere. They have to have their own country where they can go to as a response to anti-Semitism. So there was anti-Semitism in France. So would the Holocaust have developed there if France was on the losing side of World War I and it was France that had been humiliated rather than Germany? Humiliation might have, there might have been a development of ultranationalism, of a fascist government could have come to power in France on its own without waiting for the German invasion in 1940. That's certainly possible. But I don't think there would have been a Holocaust driven from France, and the reason for that is geography. What drove the Holocaust to the point where it becomes genocide was the development of what we call the Jewish problem in Eastern Europe. That the vast majority of the Jews, the millions of Jews, lived in what was called the Pale of Settlement, basically Poland, Lithuania, Galicia, and the overwhelming majority of those Jews were under the sovereignty of the Russian Empire. Most American Jews, most of us, came from what was the Russian Empire. So what you have, anti-Semitism was a part of the Nazi program, and they were rolling back the emancipation, and things were very difficult for the Jews. But when we look about, you break it into two halves. There's 1933 to 1939, the pre-war period, when the Jews suffered under terrible indignities in Nazi Germany, but there wasn't a genocide. There was discrimination. The Nazis were hoping the Jews would leave. They weren't trying to kill them. They just wanted them out of Germany. And the Nazi government was even working with the Zionists to send Jews to Palestine. There was this plan to ship them to Madagascar. The idea was to move them out of economy so much they couldn't make a living and they would be forced to leave. Unfortunately, the Nazis were also too greedy to make that work so well, because they encouraged the Jews to emigrate, but they didn't allow them to take too much wealth with them. So where could they go if they couldn't take their money with them? That's a problem with the American anti-Semitism at the same time, that the United States was not accepting Jews who were refugees from Nazi Germany unless they had enough money that they would not be a burden on the state. And yet the Nazis wouldn't let them take enough money to satisfy the requirements of the US Department of State. So that was this catch-22 that was going on then. But it was a problem of discrimination. There was Kristallnacht, but Kristallnacht was the exception, because that was when the persecution of the Jews became violent and not just economic and legal. And the German people were very unhappy overall because with what happened with the violence of Kristallnacht, when the windows were broken of German shops, Jewish German shops were looted, synagogues were destroyed. It ended up, the Nazis saw it was very unpopular. The Nazis were obsessed with public opinion. And they saw that the people were it didn't go over well. And it's the only time that you had an outbreak of violence against the Jews in Nazi Germany. Throughout the worst periods of the Holocaust, it's all quiet. The Jews are arrested in the middle of the night and they're shipped out. You know, they saw they couldn't get away with the overt violence. Things change when the war starts. war is always going to radicalize people more. But the geography was that when Nazi Germany started to acquire huge vasts of territory in the East, which was Hitler's strategy, what they called the Lebensraum for Germany, the living space. And there was this idea that Germany would colonize all this Eastern land. The more land that the German armies conquered in the East against the first Poland, first it's Czechoslovakia, then Poland, then the invasion of the Soviet Union, the more and more Jews come under German territory, which was the opposite of the anti-Semitic platform, right? The anti-Semitic platform was, Hitler said, we're going to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. And yet the more German troops moved to the East, the more and more Jews came under German control. So all the anti-Semitic work of getting the Jews to emigrate was all for naught because they were conquering too many Jews. And all of a sudden they had millions and millions of Jews under their control, and they knew what to do with. And there was no place to put them. And it's after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 is when the Holocaust turns to the genocide phase, and when they come up with the final solution. And the full name is the final solution to the Jewish problem. Because what do we do with these millions of Jews that are under our control and no one else will take them? So I said that happened because of the geography, because that's where the Jews lived. If France was the loser of World War I and not Germany, if France was the country that turned fascist in the 1930s instead of Germany, would France have been anti-Semitic under a fascist government? Of course it would have. But it would not have turned to genocide, because even if France's borders expanded, it wouldn't have found itself controlling millions of Jews the way that Nazi Germany did, because it would have had Germany as a buffer. So I think it's because of that geographical accident of where the Jews lived that they fell under control of a fascist German conquerors in 1940 and 1941, really, 1941, which is Operation Barbarossa, the surprise attack against the Soviet Union. That is what established the circumstances. So it wasn't just that Germany was ultra-nationalist and anti-Semitic, but it's also that it ended up controlling all these Jews that didn't want, which would not have been the case with France or other countries because of the way the geography worked. Was Russia near the Jews? Of course, but as I said, we already know Holocaust, we already know how that played out because Russia already lost World War I, right? And it didn't happen. So because the results of the humiliation was Russia had imploded and it became communist. So had Germany won the First World War, that is the key moment. Then everything would have different. I don't see how the Holocaust could have happened in the genocide phase that it does if that happened. And that's also, if I go back to where I started, then I'll take the chat and other questions. As a student of the German army in World War I, it's why the role of the Jewish soldiers and their service for Germany in World War I is so meaningful for me, because they fought a losing cause. But had they won, everything would have been different for us. So I always find myself rooting for Germany in the First World War, because I know what a difference, like, if you play the steps from here to there, you see where things would have gone. But alas, it didn't happen that way. It went the other way. So the next class, once we get past this point, when Germany loses World War I, that sets in motion the trajectory that takes us into the Shoah. But then we'll say, what if it went the other way? What if the Holocaust did not happen, which is the topic of the next class? Then what would have happened for Jewish history? And there's a book for America that is written. It's called Holocaust Averted by a historian from Yeshiva University. that is, it's basically an alternative history of America. It's just about American Jewry. But he tries to look at how would American Jewry have developed differently had there not been a Holocaust. It's an interesting book. But I'm going to be talking more broadly, also in the whole spread, and not just focusing on American Jewish history, but that will be the topic for the next class. This was for today. Thank you for bearing with me for whatever it was, 50 minutes. Let me read what Karen put in the chat here, and I'm happy to take other questions. Learning from the history of the development of militarism, nationalism in Germany, arising from their perception of their defamiliation, what bone can be thrown to Trump supporting right-wing Republicans. Lastly, I didn't get this far, I read before. They are victorious, valuable without sacrificing values of democracy, parents, minorities, and rule of law. I mean, look, I think one of the lessons of the Nazis' rise to power is the danger of all populist movements, right? And when you have a little bit of nationalism is good. A lot of nationalism gets dangerous. It's okay to be patriotic, right? But when you're patriotic to the point that you put your own people, your own or ethnicity or religion first, and you look down on others, that's where things get dangerous. And it's a danger it's a danger, I think, for the movement that Donald Trump inspired in this country, but it's not unique to this country. It's something that we see everywhere. Thank God it did not go in the direction that the populism in Germany in the 1930s went, but it's something that we do have to be mindful of. And I don't think it's an accident that we saw an uptick of anti-Semitism in the last administration. I certainly do not think that Donald Trump is in any way an anti-Semite, but I do think that the populist approach, and we saw it also in terms of the makeup of the attackers on the Capitol, that it encourages an anti-Semitic element. And I don't believe that was the intention of President Trump, but it is a consequence of those movements. And that's something that we need to be mindful of. And that's something that looking at these other moments in history can give us a sober perspective and understanding where things can go. Other questions or thoughts? Okay, a lot to think about, I hope, huh? Okay, Bob Dworkin, you got the floor. Unmute.
Thank you. I was just wondering if perchance the pandemic of the Spanish flu had some influence on the outcome of the German army and their movement to fight their battles.
Yeah, so the Spanish flu hits right after World War I, and it's one of the great tragedies of that period, because the world thought, oh, we got through this terrible war, and then more millions of people lost their lives because of the pandemic. In a sense, a lot of the disease is spread by people coming home from the war. When you have a mass movement of people out, spreading out. When the war happens, everyone is converging to one point. The way diseases spread is from the points, the opposite directions. When it diffuses out, that the virus is spread. So I think that was really subsequent to the war, but disease certainly played a role in the horrors of the war, the conditions of the living in the trenches and fighting, that there was, just people die from disease, and medicine that's just the beginning of, the development of field medics. And so many of the Jews, by the way, and I certainly, sure is the case in the other armies too. I'm most familiar with the German army, that you had, as you can imagine, there were a lot of Jewish doctors and Jewish nurses, and they served tremendously in the medical corps in that area. But I think that disease in war affects all sides. Germs, viruses do not respect borders, right? And that, as we certainly know that, and the experience of this pandemic. So it's something that affected all sides, and in that way it was equal. So it balanced out. So I don't think that encouraged one side's victory or defeat more than the other. And because unlike World War II, because World War I was a world war, but it was really a European war, right? You had battles elsewhere, but the real fight was in Europe, and that for the vast majority of the combatants, they were not far from home. And the French and the British were, when they leave the front, they're already in France, or they just go home. And the same thing on the other side, the German side, that if they were given leave, they'd hop on a train the next morning or afternoon, they were home, having their mother do their laundry and having a big meal, and they were able to go back and forth that way. And when they got sick, they were able to go home and convalesce in hospitals in their hometown. And it's one of the reasons why there are in Jewish cemeteries all over Germany, there are military graves, because when they got sick, whether it was from disease or whether it was from a wound, in many cases they were able to go home, and then they died at home, and they were buried in their local cemeteries. So yeah, I mean, disease certainly plays a very significant role in the war, and sometimes it helps one side more than the other. I don't think it chose sides in the First World War.
Okay, I was curious about that because learning about the Spanish flu, I found out that Donald Trump was not the first one to lie about a pandemic in the making. It appears that all of the countries involved in World War I at that time were lying about how the Spanish flu was affecting their troops and their people. They didn't want any other country to get the upper hand by thinking that their troop count was being diminished significantly by this virus. So people lie all the time, and world leaders lie all the time, and it's really a tragedy.
Yes, it is. There is a precedent for that. Let me look at Alan's question here. What is the Kaiser had not resigned and a weak democracy has not followed? Would a strong Kaiser had stopped the rise of fascism in Germany? I think so. I think that was one of the errors, another error that Woodrow Wilson, and you have to understand, Alan Sanders and I are big Woodrow Wilson fans. Sorry to speak for you, Alan. I mean, he can't help it because he went to Princeton. Wilson believed, right, you get rid of the autocrat, get rid of the Kaiser and establish democracy. But the problem is that the war, the Kaiser was responsible for the war. I mean, because he was the head of state. So when he leaves and a Republican government is established, which is a weak government because it's not, Germany did have a Reichstag, they did have a parliament, but but to make a republic was a whole new constitutional experiment that broke all the traditions. So it's very easy to put the blame on the new weak democratic government. So the opposite happened of what Wilson intended. Wilson was trying to shore up democracy, but in fact, by insisting that the Kaiser give up the throne, the effect was the opposite, right? Because a weak republic, as Alan said, comes into power that then is not given legitimacy. The Kaiser stayed in power, and had they established some kind of constitutional, they already had a constitutional monarchy. So had Parliament increased its controls, called the Reichstag, the German term for the Parliament, with the Kaiser still there accepting responsibility as the head of state, then it would have been much harder for the ultra right wing to disavow the loss, right? To not take ownership over the loss of the war. It's what's called the stab in the back myth, that the Jews were blamed for Germany's humiliation. and Jew is a code word for liberal, right? It was true then, it's true now. So it's, and the army was able to wash his hands of it. The army was able, because the army was under the command of the Kaiser. The Kaiser was the commander in chief, but the army was able to say, hey, we fought a good fight. We were all there on their territory. Then when our job was done, then these new the new republic took over. We handed them the baton. Everything that happened then is their fault. But of course, that's not the case, because it's a consequence of what the previous administration had done and what was established under the monarchy, under the empire. So I think absolutely yes. Had the Kaiser stayed in power, or had another Kaiser been given control, and there not been a reinvention of the way of the Constitution of Germany, then that would have been would have made it much harder for the Nazis to come and destroy everything. Because part of the idea behind the Nazi seizure of power is that the main idea of it was that the republic was illegitimate. Republic was illegitimate. And not only the Republic was illegitimate, they also argued that the German Empire, the Kaiser, was illegitimate. They didn't say that as overtly, but implicitly, when they say the 1,000-year Reich, which you've heard that phrase, the 1,000-year Reich, which we like to quote because it only lasted from 1933 to 1945. The reason why Hitler called it the 1,000-year Reich is it's a reference to the Holy Roman Empire, which existed from 1800 to 1800 something when Napoleon dissolved it. So he was saying is that the Second Reich, which is the German Empire, which is Bismarck, which is the Kaiser, the Jews, the Democrats, they had too much involved in it because it was a constitutional monarchy, because it was industrializing, because there was emancipation of the Jews. It would point to all those things. We're going to go back to the old way. But had the Kaiser remained in power, right, and had there not been an upheaval, it would have been harder to take root at the Republic, and the Second Reich might have been able to last. But look at all the empires that fell at the end of World War I: the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They all fell apart. So it was a tidal wave, a tsunami through the constitutional makeup of Europe as a result of the First War. So it's easy to say that the Kaiser stayed in power. That might be a little easier than saying had Germany won the war, but it was not the trend. The trend was to undo everything. And those trends were seen through cultural elements also: changes in architecture, changes in art, changes in music. There was a turn in the 1920s, completely undoing everything that was there, before. So it's. But I want to think about that more. What would be the scenario of the Kaiser remaining in power? But certainly, had the Kaiser remained in power, things would have happened differently. But, and now I'm thinking as I'm going here, right? The Constitution of Weimar Germany was a parliament, and then it had a strong president. And the president was the role of the Kaiser, of the emperor. It's just an elected president, kind of like the American president. And that was, the first one was Friedrich Ebert, who was a social democrat. But the second president was Hindenburg. And Hindenburg was a war hero and was an ultra-nationalist, was an aristocrat. And although Hindenburg had no respect for Hitler and the Nazis, and sort of tried to prevent them coming to power, at the end he did turn power over to Hitler. And the way that Hitler was able to then establish the dictatorship was when it was not only in 1933 becomes chancellor, but then when Hindenburg dies, He then becomes president, and he combines chancellor, which was the head of the legislature, with and the cabinet, but also with the presidency. And he combines the position of the president and the chancellor. Germany had a chancellor under the empire, the president's in lieu of the emperor. So it takes that position and combines it. And that could have happened after a Kaiser died also, unless there was a natural succession. So it's not that the role of a strong executive, strong head of state vanishes, because it does continue. It takes the role of Hindenburg, and then Hitler is able to seize that after Hindenburg's death. It gets dizzy when you think if something would go this way or that way, which we've been trying to do here. But thank you for that question. Any other questions? Again, thanks so much. We've been going over an hour. Thank you again so much for your attention. So we're going to go into the Shoah and the period. So talking about what happened if the Holocaust didn't happen, the focus of the next class is really going to be post-Holocaust. We're going to talk about what Israel would look like, the establishment of Israel, talk about the trajectories of Jewish history in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, really the second half of the 19th century, of the 20th century, I'm sorry. Because then the last class we'll talk about the Israeli-Palestinian politics going into the 21st century. So everybody have a wonderful Pesach, Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and see you next time.
Great.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Terrific
Thank you for your
discussion.
insight and your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Gosh,
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.